Episode 1. The First Drop. They said the cross had always been dry. For nearly 200 years it had hung above the altar of Saint Aurelia's church, untouched by dust, unchanged by time. The villagers prayed beneath it, kissed its wooden base, and believed it was watching over them. But on the morning of June 3rd, Father Mateo saw something the others didn't. A shimmer, a dark glisten, crawling down the wood like a tear that shouldn't exist. At first, he thought it was wax, left from the candle still burning after Mass. But when he reached up, the liquid was warm. It smeared across his fingertips, thick and red, pulsing faintly as though alive. Blood. He froze. The air inside the chapel grew heavier, pressing against his ribs. Somewhere in the pews, an old woman whispered a prayer. Another gasped. By the time Mateo turned back, the blood was gone, absorbed into the wood as though it had never been there. That night, the church bells tolled by themselves. The villagers gathered outside, torches flickering, eyes wide. Mateo tried to calm them, perhaps the wind, perhaps a trick of light, but no one believed him. Not when the scent of iron filled the air, thick as the smell of rain before a storm. At dawn, they found the widow Lucia lying in her garden. Her hands were folded as if in prayer. Across her chest, carved into her skin, was the perfect shape of a cross, identical to the one above Saint Aurelia's altar. No knife was found, no footprints, just a trail of red that led from her body to the church door. Inside, the cross was bleeding again. Father Mateo stared at it in horror. The drops fell slow this time, one by one, landing on the marble floor. He could hear them hit, soft, wet, deliberate. It wasn't random. Each drop seemed to choose its place. He knelt and whispered, "Why?" The air trembled. A voice, faint as breath through a grave, spoke from somewhere behind the altar. Because she hid her sin. Mateo stumbled backward, his cassock brushing against the floor. The voice was gone, but its echo lingered like smoke. He wanted to believe it was his imagination, a trick of exhaustion. Yet the next day another drop fell, and another. Every time he tried to wipe the blood away, it reappeared, thicker than before. It seeped from the wooden Christ's palms, from the crown of thorns, from the wound in his side, as if heaven itself was bleeding for the lies of men. The villagers whispered that the cross had awakened, that it could smell guilt. No one dared enter the confessional. On the seventh day, Father Mateo gathered his courage and knelt before the bleeding Christ. "If you seek confession," he said, trembling, "then show me who must speak." The candles flickered. A gust of unseen wind swept through the nave. And when Mateo lifted his eyes, he saw it. A crimson trail stretching from the altar toward the church door, out into the fog-covered village. The cross had pointed. It had chosen, and in that moment Mateo realized something terrible. The blood didn't fall because of sin. It fell because sin was being hidden, and now, the cross was hunting for it. Episode 2. The Whisper Behind the Altar Father. Mateo stopped sleeping after the seventh day. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the cross, dripping, breathing, watching. The blood had begun to crust along the edges of Christ's wooden wounds, but every morning it would break open again, fresh and red. Like the flesh itself refused to heal, he tried everything: prayer, fasting, silence. He even washed the crucifix with holy water until his hands bled. But that night, when the candles died one by one, he heard something that turned his faith to ice, a whisper. Not from outside, not from any man. It came from behind the altar. He froze mid-prayer. "Who's there?" The voice didn't answer. It was the kind of whisper that slithered instead of spoke, like the breath of someone kneeling close enough for him to feel. The words were low, tangled, and wrong, as if several tongues spoke through the same mouth. Then he heard his name, Mateo. He dropped the Bible. "Show yourself!" The silence that followed was thick, pulsing, alive. Then, as if in answer, the candles along the pews lit themselves one by one, forming a path of flame leading toward the crucifix. Mateo's breath caught. The face of the wooden Christ seemed to move. Its eyes, carved and unseeing, glistened with something human, sorrow perhaps, or judgment. From its mouth, a single drop of blood fell onto the altar cloth. Mateo stumbled closer. "What do you want from me?" The whisper returned, this time inside his skull. "Confession. I do confess," he said. "Every day not theirs, The voice interrupted, sharp as a blade. Yours? Mateo's throat went dry. Mine? But before he could finish, the church bells clanged, once, twice, then fell silent mid-echo. The door burst open and the caretaker, old Tommaso, ran in panting. Father, come quick! The widow's house, it's covered in blood! Mateo followed him into the fog. Lucia's cottage was red from roof to ground, as though the rain itself had turned to blood. Inside, on the wall above her bed, someone, or something, had written words in long, dripping strokes. He hid his sin too. Tommaso stared at the message, trembling. Who does it mean, Father? Mateo couldn't answer. He could still feel the whisper inside him, breathing with his heartbeat, curling around his thoughts. When he turned back toward the church, he saw it, faint but visible in the moonlight, a thin crimson trail leading all the way to the altar. He followed it at dawn. The whisper was waiting. You cannot wipe away what you buried, it said. The cross remembers. Mateo fell to his knees, gripping the cold stone floor, tears and fear mingling on his lips. Then tell me, he begged, what did I bury? The whisper sighed, almost tender. Not what, Father, it said. Who? Episode 3. The Confession of the Widow. By the time the sun rose over Saint Aurelia's, the widow's grave was already being dug. No priest had been asked to bless the ground. No family had come to mourn. The villagers whispered that her soul had no place in heaven, that the cross itself had rejected her. Father Mateo watched from the church steps, his hands hidden in his sleeves. He hadn't slept since the whisper. It had followed him everywhere, not in words but in sensations. Cold breath against his ear. The weight of unseen eyes pressing on his chest. When the coffin was lowered, a drop of red fell from the sky. It landed on the lid, small as a tear, but Mateo saw it clearly. Blood. Again. He whispered a prayer and returned to the chapel. Inside, the air was colder than before. The candles refused to stay lit. The cross loomed above him, darker, the wood glistening as if freshly varnished with sin. Beneath it, the floor was stained, not from the widow's blood, but from something older, deeper. Mateo knelt. If she sinned, then tell me why, he whispered. The silence that answered him was so complete it felt like a presence. Then, faintly from the confessional booth at the side of the nave came the creak of wood. The curtain swayed. Someone was inside. Mateo rose and approached. Who seeks confession? A woman's voice answered, fragile, trembling, like the sound of someone speaking through water. I do, Father, he hesitated. The tone was familiar. Lucia? Yes, she said. But they buried me. The breath in his lungs turned to ice. He yanked open the curtain. Empty, but the air inside smelled of roses and decay, the scent Lucia always carried when she came to pray. On the floor, resting where a penitent's knees should be, lay a rosary. Its beads were slick with blood. Then the voice came again, not from the booth this time, but from everywhere. I hid my sin beneath his tongue, it said. I fed him until his body stopped, and still he thanked me. I thought God would forgive me, Father. But the cross, it never did. The crucifix above the altar groaned, its wood cracking as though alive. From the wound in Christ's side, a stream of blood began to flow, steady, unending. It ran across the altar cloth, down the steps, and pooled around Mateo's feet. He fell backward, whispering prayers through his teeth, but the voice only grew louder. I confessed too late. I confessed to you, and you did not believe me. Mateo covered his ears. Stop, please. You buried me in holy ground, Father, the voice hissed. But holiness cannot hold the damned. Then the church door slammed shut. The candles burst to life, and on the wall behind the altar, drawn in blood that shimmered like fire, appeared 7 words. Your hands buried more than one sin. Mateo stood frozen, heart hammering. The blood from the cross crept closer, touching his shoes like a living thing. And for the first time, he understood the whisper's meaning. The cross didn't only bleed for the sins of others, it bled for his. Episode 4. Blood in the baptismal font. It began during the baptism. Sunday morning. The church was crowded, families in pressed clothes, babies wrapped in lace, the air thick with incense and whispers. Father Mateo stood at the altar, his face pale beneath the flicker of candlelight. His hands trembled as he poured holy water into the baptismal font. He tried not to look up, not at the cross above him, not at the wound that never healed. The villagers pretended not to see the stains spreading across the marble floor. Faint, rust-colored, the ghost of blood scrubbed away 100 times. But everyone knew. They just refused to name it. The first baby brought forward was little Paolo, son of Marco the blacksmith. Mateo dipped his fingers into the font. The water felt warm, almost alive. In nomine Patris, he began, lowering his hand toward the child's forehead. But before he could finish, the water turned dark. At first it was a faint swirl, like dust caught in sunlight. Then it thickened. Red veins spread through the font, pulsing outward from Mateo's touch until the entire basin was filled with blood. Gasps rippled through the church. A woman screamed. The baby began to wail. Mateo stumbled backward. No, this cannot be. But the cross above the altar began to drip again, slow, deliberate drops falling onto the marble below. Each one struck the ground in rhythm with the infant's cries. The congregation surged toward the door, shouting prayers, clutching their children. Only Marco stayed behind, his face twisted with rage. "What curse have you brought on us, Father?" he shouted. "You made God bleed." "I didn't," Mateo began, but stopped. Because he saw it. In Marco's arms, the baby's lips were stained red, and not from the water. The child was chewing, softly, almost peacefully, on a small iron nail, slick with blood. Where had it come from? Mateo knew. It was one of the nails missing from the crucifix. The blacksmith's hands trembled. "It's just a trick," he muttered. "It must be." Then, from the font, bubbles rose, thick, red, whispering as they burst. Mateo leaned closer and heard it. Faint voices, countless, overlapping, like the breath of the damned. "Confess, confess, confess." He stumbled back, sloshing the blood onto the floor. It crawled toward him, following his boots. Marco fled, clutching his child, his shouts echoing through the village. "Saint Aurelia's is cursed. The priest has defiled the font." Mateo fell to his knees. The church was empty now, save for the sound of dripping, blood falling from the crucifix into the red-stained basin. He whispered, "Why the child? He is innocent." The whisper answered from behind him, soft as breath. "No one is born innocent, Father. Only unconfessed." Mateo turned, but there was no one. Only the baptismal font, now dry, its surface cracked as if something beneath it had drunk the blood. He felt it then, a faint vibration under the marble, beating, like a heart. The church was alive, and it was remembering. Episode 5. The Choir. That sang lies, they said music was the language of heaven. But that morning, it sounded like something trying to claw its way out of hell. The choir of Saint Aurelia's had gathered as usual, 12 voices, pure and bright, echoing through the nave. The hymn was meant to cleanse the air after the baptism, to drive away the whispers that lingered in the walls. Yet as their song rose, Father Mateo could feel something wrong pulsing beneath the harmony. A note that did not belong, low and alive, like the groan of a wounded beast. He looked up. The cross was bleeding again. At first, only a drop or two, then more. Thick streams ran down the wooden figure's arms, dripping onto the altar below. The singers didn't stop. They didn't even seem to see it. Their eyes were half closed, mouths open, faces wrapped in devotion. Mateo stepped forward. "Stop singing," he said softly. No one heard him. He raised his voice. "Enough!" Still they sang, but now the words had changed. The Latin of the hymn had warped into something darker, syllables twisting into sounds no tongue should know. Their voices layered on top of each other, rising into a single, unbearable scream disguised as music. And then, all at once, silence. The organ burst, pipes snapping, keys splitting, and the choir froze. One by one, their eyes rolled upward, white as marble. A single drop of blood slid from each singer's mouth, down their chins, staining their robes. Mateo rushed to the altar, grabbing the nearest boy by the shoulders. "What's happening to you?" The boy's lips moved, but the voice that answered wasn't his. "You silenced her," it said. Mateo's hands went cold. Silenced who? The one who told the truth. Before he could ask more, a sound filled the church. The echo of a woman's laughter, distant and wet, as if carried through water. The candles flickered violently. Every hymn book in the pews flipped open to the same page. Psalm 51. Wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow. The pages bled. Red lines oozed through the ink, spreading across the words until the verses became something else entirely, a confession written in blood. We sang of miracles that never were. We sang of mercy we did not believe in. We sang to hide what he did behind the altar. Mateo stumbled backward, the air thick with the metallic scent of truth. No, he whispered. No, that's impossible. But the cross above him began to drip faster, and this time the blood fell in rhythm. Each drop struck the marble like a drumbeat, slow and steady, one for each voice in the choir. By the time the bells tolled noon, every singer was dead, their throats marked with thin, dark lines shaped like the strings of a harp. Mateo stood alone in the silence, staring up at the bleeding Christ. The whisper came again, soft as forgiveness, sharp as a knife. Every song hides a sin, Father, even yours. And beneath the choir loft, Mateo found what the hymn books had hidden for years, a sealed wooden box carved with a single name. Lucia, the widow's name. The one who had begged him once to let her join the choir. He opened the box. Inside was a letter written in her hand. If they sing again, the blood will never stop. The cross dripped once more, a slow, heavy drop that landed on the letter's last word. And this time, Mateo didn't wipe it away. He let it bleed. Episode 6. The Nun Who Hid Her Desire. They said Sister Elena's prayers could make the candles flicker, but Father Mateo knew the truth. It wasn't prayer that made the flames tremble. It was her trembling heart. Elena had joined the convent at 16, pale and silent, a girl who blushed at every blessing. She sang softly, prayed longer than anyone else, and kept her eyes lowered whenever Mateo spoke. Too humble, the nun said. Too pure. But purity, he had learned, is a mask that bleeds when you wear it too long. It began one night after the choir's deaths. The convent stood beside the church, its corridors thick with the smell of candle wax and secrets. Mateo had gone there to pray with the sisters, hoping to calm the whispers that haunted Saint Aurelia's. He found Elena kneeling before the chapel cross, her veil fallen to her shoulders. Her hands were clasped, but her lips moved too quickly for prayer. Elena, Mateo said softly, it's late. She turned. Her eyes glistened in the candlelight, eyes that didn't belong to a saint but to someone burning from the inside out. I was praying for them, she said. The choir, the widow, the child. They said the cross bled for their sins, but what if it bleeds for desire too? Mateo frowned. Desire is not always sin. Her voice dropped to a whisper. It is when you wear the veil. A tear slipped down her cheek. Except it wasn't a tear. When it reached her chin, it shone dark red. Blood. Mateo stepped closer. Elena. But she shuddered, gripping her chest. It burns, Father. Every night when I close my eyes, he comes to me. The Christ. His wounds glow and his lips move. He tells me he knows what I feel for you. The words froze him. She looked up at the crucifix behind him and gasped. The wood was bleeding again, but not from the wounds, from the heart. Slow, rhythmic streams pulsed from the center of Christ's chest, landing on the floor between them. Elena's breath quickened. She reached toward it. He bleeds because I hide it. I tried to bury it in prayer, but it grows. I see him every night, and sometimes... Her voice broke. Sometimes it's not his voice I hear, Father. It's yours. Mateo took her hands. You mustn't speak this way. But the air shifted, heavy, alive. The candles blew out all at once. In the dark, the whisper returned, crawling along the walls. Desire unspoken is sin unconfessed. The crucifix cracked. Blood spilled faster now, forming a line that crept across the floor, circling the nun and the priest like a serpent. Elena fell to her knees, sobbing, "Forgive me, Father. I wanted him. I wanted you." Mateo tried to speak, but his tongue felt heavy, his heart pounding with something he refused to name. The whisper grew louder, inside him, outside him, everywhere. Then the bleeding stopped. For a moment, silence. Then, slowly, Elena lifted her head. Her eyes were bright, her lips trembling in a smile that wasn't hers. "He forgave me," she said. He took it away. And before Mateo could understand what she meant, she collapsed. When he lifted her, her habit was soaked in red. From her chest, from where her heart had been, bloomed a perfect cross. That night, Father Mateo knelt before the altar, shaking. The whisper was gone, but something new lingered, a warmth in his chest that wasn't his own. He looked up at the crucifix. The heart was no longer bleeding, because now it was beating. Episode 7, The Boy Who Drew the Devil. The first time Luca drew the devil, he was smiling. Not the devil, but Luca himself, a soft, childlike grin as his small hand glided across the paper, sketching horns, eyes, and a mouthful of teeth sharper than truth. Father Mateo had been visiting the orphanage beside Saint Aurelia's, trying to quiet the rumors after Sister Elena's death. The children whispered that she still walked the halls at night, her veil dragging like a shadow that couldn't forget. But Mateo's eyes stopped on the boy in the corner. A thin child, silent, drawing furiously with a broken piece of charcoal. "What are you drawing, son?" Luca looked up. His eyes were dark, deeper than any child's should be. He turned the paper around. It was the cross, the same wooden crucifix that bled in the church, except this time a figure hung beside it, twisted, grinning, with nails through its hands too. But the face wasn't Christ's. It was Father Mateo's. Mateo's chest tightened. "Who told you to draw this?" "No one," Luca whispered. "He showed me." "Who?" "The man behind the cross." Mateo's throat went dry. "There is no man behind the cross." The boy's lips curved. "There wasn't, until you came." He tore another piece of paper and began sketching again. His fingers moved faster now, like he was only copying something already burned into his mind. When he was done, he lifted it for Mateo to see. This time, the drawing was of the church's altar. And from the ceiling, a dark figure was hanging upside down, its wings spread, dripping black ink. But what froze Mateo wasn't the creature itself. It was the small detail in its hand. A rosary, identical to his. That night, when Mateo returned to the chapel, he found something waiting for him on the altar. Luca's drawing. The candles had been extinguished, but the light from the moon traced the edges of the paper. He looked up at the cross and froze. Behind it, a shadow moved. At first, he thought it was a trick of the flickering light, until he saw the outline of a face pressed against the wooden back of the crucifix, as though something was trapped inside, struggling to push through. Mateo stumbled backward. The whisper that had haunted him since Elena's death rose again, stronger now, no longer echoing through the church, but speaking directly from the cross itself. "You hid desire, priest. Now you hide fear." Blood began seeping from the eyes of Christ, slow at first, then spilling down in streams that reached the floor. The drops landed on Luca's drawing and the paper hissed, the ink moving, reshaping. The devil that Luca had drawn began to smile wider. Its mouth opened, and inside Mateo could see his own reflection, trembling, praying, lying. He snatched the drawing and threw it into the fire of the nearest candle. But instead of burning, the flames turned black. And from the darkness of the smoke, a child's voice whispered, "You can't burn what you already invited in." The next morning, the orphanage matron screamed. Every wall in the hallway was covered with drawings, hundreds of them. Each one showed the same thing, the cross bleeding endlessly. And in every drawing, a small boy stood beneath it, holding a piece of charcoal, smiling with empty eyes. Luca was gone. But in the pew where he always sat, Father Mateo found one last paper. It was simple, a single line of writing in a child's hand. "When the last sin is hidden, the cross will bleed no more. Because it won't need to, and beneath the note a handprint, small, bloody, still warm. Episode 8. The bells that rang inside the dead. The bells of Saint Aurelia hadn't rung in weeks. Not since Father Mateo locked the tower and swore no hand would touch its rope again. Yet that night, they did. The sound came not from above, but from below. At first, the villagers thought it was thunder, distant and trembling beneath their feet. But as the earth shuddered, they heard it clearly, the soft metallic chime of bells, echoing from the graves behind the church. Mateo ran barefoot through the storm, his cassock soaked and clinging to his body, the crucifix on his chest swaying violently with each step. Lightning cracked above, illuminating the old cemetery. And for a moment, he saw them. The crosses planted over each grave were trembling. And from the freshly turned soil, faint red light pulsed beneath the surface, the same color as the blood that bled from the church's crucifix. He fell to his knees beside Sister Elena's grave. "No," he whispered. Not again. The ground beneath him throbbed, as if the earth itself had a heartbeat. Then came the ringing, gentle at first, then louder. A wave of sound rising from every tomb. Ding! 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 Each bell struck in perfect rhythm, though no human hand pulled the rope. He looked toward the church, where the bleeding cross stood shrouded in moonlight. The blood was no longer dripping. It was flowing, steady as rain. The crucifix looked almost alive, its carved body twisting ever so slightly, and through the hum of the storm, Mateo heard it, a whisper not from above, but from below. "Father," he froze. "Father, we still pray." It was Elena's voice. "No," he gasped, pressing his hands to his ears. "You are not her." But the voice continued, trembling, mournful, and soon others joined it. The dead were speaking, hundreds of voices blending into one endless murmur beneath the soil. "Confess for us, Father. You left us unshriven." Mateo stumbled back. His stomach twisted as he remembered the flood. The dozens who had drowned when the river rose last year. He had buried them quickly without rites, without absolution. He thought he could hide it. He thought God would forgive what necessity demanded. But now the bells of the forgotten were tolling for him. He ran into the church and fell before the cross. Blood dripped onto his shoulders, warm and thick. "Please make it stop. I have done all I could." A drop fell from Christ's wound onto his cheek. It burned like fire. Then he heard it again, faint but clear. "They ring for your sins." "Not ours." He turned toward the entrance. The church doors were open. Through them, he could see figures moving between the graves, pale shapes swaying like candle flames, each holding a bell in skeletal hands, and they were walking toward him. One by one, the bells grew louder. Each chime made the candles flicker, the walls groan, the very air quiver with invisible weight. Mateo tried to run, but his feet felt rooted to the stone floor. The sound filled the church, vibrating through his bones. Then a bell rang inside his own chest. He gasped, clutching his heart, feeling something move within him. It wasn't beating anymore. It was tolling. Slowly, solemnly, he fell forward, his vision blurring, and as he collapsed before the cross, he heard the final whisper, not from the dead, but from the bleeding Christ above him. "Now you ring for the living." When the villagers found Father Mateo the next morning, his body lay beneath the crucifix, eyes wide open, mouth frozen mid-prayer. But when they leaned closer, they heard it faintly. A soft rhythmic sound, a bell, ringing from somewhere deep inside his chest. Episode 9, the confession that echoed without a voice. They buried Father Mateo without music. No choir, no incense, no final bell, only silence. But even silence in Saint Aurelia had begun to sound alive. When the new priest arrived, a young man named Father Corvin, he found the church empty, yet heavy, as though the air itself was remembering. The villagers wouldn't enter anymore. They said the cross still bled, even after Mateo's death. They said his body twitched in the coffin whenever someone lied near his grave. Corvin didn't believe it. At least, not at first. He came from the city, from a seminary that prized order over faith. He saw superstition as a sickness of the ignorant. But as he stepped inside the chapel for the first time, even he felt something move beneath his ribs, like a prayer trying to escape before it was spoken. The cross stood before him, massive and ancient, its wooden surface glistening faintly in the candlelight. At its base, the floor was stained dark, as if centuries of hidden sins had soaked into the stone. He approached. "If this is truly your sign, then show me," he whispered. "Bleed if you must. Speak if you can. Nothing. Only silence." But when he turned to leave, he heard it. A breath. Not from the wind, not from outside, but from the confessional booth beside the altar. A slow, ragged inhale, he froze. "Who's there?" No reply. He stepped closer, pushing the curtain aside. Inside, the booth was empty, except for a rosary hanging from the small screen, its beads slick with something dark and sticky. Blood. Then came the whisper. A man's voice, soft, trembling. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned." Corvin's skin prickled. "Who is this?" The voice continued, hollow and strange. "My sin." His silence. Corvin leaned closer to the grill. "Speak, my child. What have you done?" But the voice didn't answer. Instead, the whisper became louder, echoing through the wooden chamber, overlapping with itself, like a dozen versions of the same man, speaking from different corners of hell. "I stayed silent when she screamed. I stayed silent when he begged. I stayed silent when God stopped listening." Corvin stumbled back. The booth was trembling now, as if someone inside was pounding against its walls. He tore open the door, only to find it empty, but etched into the wooden seat, carved deep into the grain, were the words, "Confession means nothing if you can't hear your own guilt." And from the shadows of the booth, a shape began to form, thin as smoke, rising, twisting, until it took the shape of a man kneeling, its head tilted upward, its mouth open as though screaming, but no sound came. Corvin's crucifix swung violently on his chest, the metal burning cold against his skin. The shape reached toward him, fingers stretching, shaking. Then, from the main altar, the cross began to bleed again. But this time, the blood didn't fall. It rose, floating upward, swirling into the air like red mist. The droplets drifted toward the confessional, gathering around the ghostly figure, soaking into its form until it became solid, human, real. And when the last drop touched the figure's lips, it whispered again, this time in Mateo's voice. "Father Corvin, will you hide your sin better than I did?" Corvin stepped back, his heart pounding. "You're not real," the figure smiled. "That's what I told myself." The candles went out. The church plunged into darkness, and in that blackness a single sound broke the silence, an echo that didn't belong to the living, the sound of someone whispering a confession. From the other side of the screen. Episode 10, The Mirror Behind the Altar. The morning after the voice in the confessional, Father Corvin found a crack running down the center of the altar. It hadn't been there before. It looked almost deliberate, as if the stone itself had been split by something trying to escape. When he knelt to inspect it, he noticed faint lines beneath the marble, shapes that shouldn't have existed in stone. Circles, marks, letters in a language older than Latin. The crack widened as he touched it. From within came a gust of air, cold and ancient, smelling faintly of metal and rot. And beneath that smell, incense. Corvin pulled back, heart racing. "Who built this?" he whispered. The answer came not from the church, but from the diary he found buried beneath the altar steps, a leather book so old it crumbled at his touch. The first page was signed by a name that made his blood turn to ice, Mateo. He opened it carefully. The words were written in shaking ink. "The cross bleeds for our lies, but the mirror bleeds for our truth." The next page held a sketch, an image of the church's altar. Behind it, hidden in the wall, was a door leading to a small chamber. Inside that chamber stood a single object, a mirror. Mateo had drawn it cracked, as if it too had tried to shatter its own reflection. By nightfall, Corvin couldn't resist. He moved the altar aside, every shove echoing through the empty nave like thunder, and revealed a small wooden door, sealed by nails blackened with age. Each nail bore a faint symbol of a bleeding cross. He hesitated, then pried them loose. The moment the last nail fell, the air grew heavy. The candles dimmed, and somewhere deep within the walls, something groaned, slow, deliberate, aware. He opened the door. Inside was a narrow room lined with stone, barely wide enough for one man to stand. At the far end hung a mirror, tall and thin, its surface dark with centuries of dust. Yet even through the grime, Corvin saw a faint shimmer, like light trapped beneath glass. He lifted a candle and stepped closer. His reflection appeared distorted, stretched as if it existed deeper than the mirror's surface. He stared, waiting for it to mimic his breath, his blink. But it didn't. His reflection stood still, and then it smiled. Corvin dropped the candle. The flame died, but the room did not fall into darkness. Instead, the mirror began to glow from within, its surface rippling like water. From inside, his reflection spoke in a calm, steady voice. "You wanted proof, Father. You wanted to see what sin looks like when it's honest." Corvin trembled. "Who are you?" The reflection tilted its head. "The man you pray to when you think no one's listening." Then, from within the glass, Corvin saw movement, shadows of other faces pressing against the surface, screaming soundlessly, their mouths gaping wide. For an instant, he recognized one of them, Mateo. The reflection lifted its hand, mirroring his movement. But when Corvin stepped back, it didn't. It reached forward, palm pressing against the inside of the glass. Blood began to bloom beneath its touch, spreading in spirals across the mirror. And for the first time, Corvin saw it clearly. The reflection wasn't his. It was wearing his face, but its eyes were those of something that had seen heaven burn. The mirror cracked. Once. Twice. And from the fractures, blood began to flow. When Corvin stumbled out of the hidden chamber gasping, he saw that the great cross above the altar had stopped bleeding entirely. The wounds were dry. The face of Christ seemed empty. He fell to his knees, whispering prayers that no longer felt like prayers. Then he heard a sound behind him, a faint echo from the chamber. A voice. Soft, calm, familiar. "Your reflection is still praying." "Father." He turned. The door to the hidden chamber was closed again, and from behind it, the sound of whispers rose and fell like 1,000 unseen tongues repeating a single terrible prayer. Episode 11. The Saint Who Forgot Her Name. The villagers called her La Santa del Olvido, the Saint of Forgetting. But in Saint Aurelia, no one prayed to her out loud anymore. Her statue stood at the edge of the churchyard, veiled in moss, hands bound in rosary chains. No one remembered who she was, or what miracle she had performed to earn sainthood. Her name had been erased from every record, every hymn, every prayer. Only one thing remained carved into the base of her statue. She prayed until heaven forgot her. When Father Corvin first read those words, he felt an ache he couldn't explain, a sadness that didn't belong to him. It had been 3 nights since he opened the mirror's chamber. Sleep came in fragments. When he closed his eyes, he saw his reflection whispering psalms backwards. When he woke, there was always blood beneath the cross again, though he knew he'd cleaned it. That morning, a villager approached him, a young woman named Inez. Her hands shook as she spoke. "Father, the saint." "She's weeping." He followed her to the graveyard. There, beneath the first light of dawn, he saw it, thick red tears dripping from the statue's eyes, streaking her stone cheeks like veins of rust. Inez crossed herself. "They say she was punished for remembering sins that weren't hers. That's why God took her name." Corvin touched the base of the statue. The stone was warm, alive. He could feel something pulsing beneath the surface, faint but steady. He looked closer. Carved into her wrist, barely visible under the rosary chains, were fresh letters scratched by some desperate hand. Mateo. Corvin's heart froze. No, impossible. That night he returned alone, lantern in hand. The storm had begun again, the same kind of rain that drowned the village years before. Lightning flashed as he knelt before the nameless saint. He whispered, "If you ever were holy, tell me what Mateo did." For a moment, nothing. Then the lantern flickered. The air turned heavy, pressing against his chest like unseen hands. The statue's lips moved, at first just a tremor. Then a whisper, dry, rasping like stone learning to breathe again. He confessed what should have stayed hidden. Corvin stepped back, trembling. What did he hide? The saint's eyes opened, wide, bleeding light. Not his sin, yours. The ground beneath her cracked open. The rosary chains fell away one by one, clattering like bones. A hollow sound rose from below, a heartbeat echoing through the soil, and then he saw it. Beneath the broken base, a small reliquary glowed with crimson light. Inside was a relic, a single finger bone wrapped in black cloth. But carved into the bone, clear as day, was his name, Corvin. He staggered backward. No, this can't be. The statue's head turned toward him, stone grinding against stone. You think you came to cleanse this church, she hissed, voice splitting like thunder. But you were sent to finish what he began. Blood erupted from the statue's eyes, splattering across Corvin's cassock. The relic pulsed brighter, and the storm outside grew violent, every thunderclap sounding like the toll of a bell. Then came the whisper, low and furious, echoing from everywhere at once, from the graves. The church, the mirror, saints forget, crosses bleed, priests lie. Corvin fell to his knees. What are you? The saint smiled, her face cracking into 1,000 lines. The last prayer that God refused to hear. Lightning struck the church tower, splitting it in two, and when Corvin looked up again, the statue was gone. Only the relic remained, still glowing faintly, pulsing in the rain. He picked it up with trembling hands. For an instant, he thought he heard his own heartbeat in it, but the rhythm was wrong. It wasn't beating. It was ringing. Episode 12. The relic that spoke in tongues. It began the moment Father Corvin placed the relic on the altar. At first, it seemed harmless, just a small bone wrapped in black cloth, pulsing faintly in rhythm with something unseen. The rain outside had stopped, but the silence it left behind was unnatural, as if the air itself were holding its breath. He whispered a prayer. His voice trembled, weak but steady. Deus miseretur mei, and the relic answered, not in Latin, not in any human tongue. It spoke in a language that wasn't sound but sensation, a vibration that ran beneath his skin, rattling his bones, whispering through his teeth. Every word carried the weight of memory, like a prayer remembered by something that was never meant to pray. Corvin stumbled back, clutching his ears. The relic's glow intensified, seeping through the cloth like veins of molten light. Then came the voices. At first one, soft, distant, calling his name. Then another, and another, until the church filled with whispers, 100 tongues speaking in unison, each echoing his prayers in reverse. Rite Messire siued. He dropped to his knees. Stop, please stop. But the relic only pulsed harder, and the cross above him began to tremble. Thin streams of blood leaked from the carved Christ's wounds again, but this time the blood didn't fall. It rose, drifting through the air like smoke, drawn toward the relic as though it were feeding. The whispering grew louder, louder, until it wasn't whispering anymore. The sound became a chorus, a violent, ecstatic song echoing from the walls, the pews, even the very stones beneath his feet. And hidden within that chorus, Corvin heard something familiar. His own voice, repeating the words of every confession he had ever heard, every lie, every sin, every secret. It wasn't just speaking tongues. It was translating guilt. He clutched his chest. You're not holy. You're not of God. From behind him, the mirror door creaked open. A soft, rhythmic dripping echoed from within. Corvin turned, and there, reflected in the mirror's dark surface, he saw her, the saint. Her face cracked, bleeding light. Her mouth moved in perfect harmony with the relic's song. You prayed to silence, she whispered, but silence answers too. The relic throbbed violently now, spilling light across the altar. The black cloth disintegrated, revealing the bone beneath, covered in inscriptions that twisted and rearranged themselves as he watched. Each symbol pulsed, reshaping into words he could almost read. Almost. He reached out. The instant his fingers brushed it, the church screamed. Every candle exploded into ash. The stained glass windows shattered, raining colors like broken prayers. The air grew thick, vibrating with a force that made his teeth ache. Then, quiet. Corvin opened his eyes. He was no longer in the church. He stood in a vast, endless cathedral made of black glass. And in every reflection he saw himself, but not quite. Some of his reflections were kneeling, others bleeding, others hanging from invisible crosses. In the distance, something was approaching, a shape of light and shadow, moving with the rhythm of the relic's heartbeat. He whispered, "Who are you?" The figure stopped before him. 1,000 voices answered as one. We are every prayer that was never forgiven. Corvin fell to his knees, sobbing. What do you want from me?" The figure reached out a hand made of flame and blood. "Confess." He hesitated. "Confess." The voices demanded louder, shaking the cathedral. Finally, he whispered, "I lost my faith." The figure smiled. "No, Father, you buried it." And as it touched his forehead, the relic inside the real church split open, unleashing a sound so pure, so violent, that every cross in Saint Aurelia cracked in half. By dawn, the villagers found Corvin collapsed before the altar, eyes open, lips moving soundlessly. When they leaned close, they heard it. He was still praying, but the words coming from his mouth were not in any language the world had ever known, and the relic beside him. It was gone. Only a faint mark remained, burned into the altar. 5 words glowing softly in the morning light. Faith is the oldest sin. Chapter 13. The Confession That Never Ended. The confessional smelled of iron and incense. Father Gabriel sat inside, his hands trembling, the old cross hanging above him, still wet from a thin trickle of blood that refused to dry. It had been bleeding for hours, ever since the last confession began. The woman on the other side hadn't spoken in minutes. Only her breathing filled the silence, shallow and uneven, like someone hiding a secret too big for words. "Daughter," Father Gabriel whispered, his voice cracking, "you may speak freely. God listens to those who repent." Her whisper came, trembling yet sharp enough to cut through the dark. "Father, what happens if I confess something that isn't my sin?" He frowned. "Then it is not yours to confess. But what if the sin lives inside someone else, and through me it can finally be heard?" The bleeding from the cross thickened, a single drop hitting the wooden booth between them. Gabriel looked up. The wood seemed to pulse. "Who are you speaking for?" he asked. There was a pause. Then in a voice that didn't sound entirely human, she said, "For you." The booth fell silent. Even the distant church bells, always ringing at the hour, seemed to stop. He wanted to open the door to see who was speaking, but fear froze his body. He remembered her earlier words, her strange prayer before the session began. "Forgive me, Father, for I have seen the truth that makes even angels weep." The confessional's wooden walls began to creak. The candles outside flickered violently, casting shadows that moved like open mouths. The woman continued, voice breaking. "I saw what you buried beneath the altar. The silver chalice with the child's blood. The pages of your sermon soaked in it. I saw you asking God to forgive what can't be forgiven." Gabriel felt his chest tighten. He wanted to deny it, but his throat locked. The cross above them started dripping faster, blood pooling on the floor. He pressed his hands against his ears, whispering, "Stop, please stop." The voice laughed softly. "This is not confession anymore, Father. This is resurrection." And then the booth door swung open. There was no woman, only a mirror. A tall, cracked mirror reflecting him, except the version in the glass was smiling. The reflection raised a hand and placed it on the bleeding cross. The blood stopped. Gabriel's reflection leaned closer and whispered from the other side of the glass, "I absolve you." A scream echoed through the church. The parishioners rushed in to find the confessional empty, except for Father Gabriel's robes, folded neatly beneath the mirror. And above them, the cross hung silent and clean, no longer bleeding. But from the confessional's shadows, faintly, a whisper lingered, as if the sin itself still wanted to speak. "Forgive me, Father, for I am not done yet." Chapter 14. The Sermon of the Mirror. No one had touched the cross since Father Gabriel vanished. The church had been sealed, its doors barred by trembling hands, but every night, the same sound echoed from within. A single drop of blood hitting the floor, steady as a heartbeat. When the villagers finally dared to return, they found the confessional gone. In its place stood a mirror, tall and black as oil, with a thin silver cross etched into its surface. The priest's robes were still folded neatly beneath it. Untouched, the bishop ordered a new sermon to be held, to restore faith and silence superstition. The church filled that Sunday, the air thick with fear disguised as devotion. Candles trembled in their holders. The villagers crossed themselves repeatedly, whispering that Father Gabriel's reflection had been seen wandering near the altar at dusk. The new preacher, Father Mateo, stepped up to the pulpit. His voice was calm, but his eyes kept drifting toward the mirror. "Brothers and sisters," he began, "let us pray not for the dead, but for the truth. For it is truth that cleanses the soul." As he spoke, something strange began to happen. The mirror's surface rippled, once like water disturbed by breath. Then faces began to appear. Not ghostly faces, but their faces, the congregation's, reflected with impossible precision. At first, it was subtle. A mother saw herself praying, but her reflection's lips kept moving even when hers were still. A child stared at his reflection, only to see it grin while he trembled. Then the murmurs began. "What's happening? My reflection, it's speaking. Father Mateo!" The mirror, the preacher turned. His own reflection was gone. The mirror showed only the congregation, each face whispering words no one could hear, except the one it belonged to. Then came the screams. A man fell to his knees, clutching his head. It's telling me what I did," he cried. How could it know? Blood began to bloom from the silver cross carved into the mirror. A red line trickled downward, and the whispers turned into a chorus. Each reflection spoke a sin. Each one bled a truth. The mirror pulsed brighter with every confession, not spoken aloud, but dragged from the soul, unwillingly. "Stop it," Father Mateo shouted, raising the Bible high. "In the name of the Lord." But when he looked down, his Bible was soaked. The pages were crimson, letters smearing into shapes of moving words. "Thou shalt not hide." The church doors slammed shut. The candles exploded. Every reflection turned toward the pulpit. Father Mateo's voice broke. "What do you want from us?" And from within the mirror, a voice answered, deep, familiar, and wet with sorrow. Truth. Nothing else ever satisfied him. The mirror shattered. Shards scattered across the floor, each one still reflecting a sin, a kiss never confessed, a lie whispered at a deathbed, a murder disguised as mercy. When dawn came, the church was silent. The mirror was gone. But the villagers swore that their reflections no longer followed them exactly. Sometimes, in their windows or wells, they still saw themselves, praying, even when they weren't. Chapter 15. The Blood That Refused to Dry. By sunrise, the village looked ordinary, bathed in golden light that promised peace. But inside every home, in every corner where shadow lingered, something had changed. The blood had returned. It wasn't on the walls, nor in the streets. It seeped from the floors, rising slowly like fog, staining the wood of doors and the stone of thresholds. Wherever someone had hidden a sin, a lie, a theft, a desire unspoken, the blood appeared, warm and relentless. Father Mateo returned to the church, heart hammering. He found the altar clean, the cross dry, but the smell of iron hung thick in the air. His hands shook as he looked down. On the floor, a trail of blood-formed words. Sin is never silent. The villagers gathered in fear, eyes wide. Some had tried to scrub their floors, wash their walls, but no water, no soap, no blessing could remove it. And each night, the blood flowed again, thicker, darker, pooling where secrets slept. Children whispered of shadows moving in the red, of faces appearing and mouthing words they didn't know. Mothers found their own sins reflected in the blood, the stolen bread, the harsh words, the prayers ignored. Fathers saw debts unspoken, betrayals hidden, violence buried. Father Mateo realized the truth. The village itself had become a confessional, and the cross had not stopped bleeding. It had just spread, infecting every soul unwilling to face its hidden sins. He knelt before the cross, now perched on the altar, dry yet accusing. "Lord, what do we do?" he begged. The answer came in silence, but the blood answered for him. It rose in streams, forming shapes, letters, images. One stream depicted Father Gabriel, hands raised, eyes open, whispering in tongues. Another showed the saint who forgot her name, hands pressed to her face, crying light that turned to red. And then the worst, a shape that pulsed from the center of the altar, a shadow that wore the face of every villager at once. Smiling with teeth too sharp to be human, eyes wide and unblinking, the shadow spoke, its voice the combined weight of every hidden sin. "Confess, or let this village drown in what you deny." Panic erupted. The villagers ran, trying to escape their homes, their floors, the streets, but the blood followed. It crept up their legs, stained their hands, whispered their secrets aloud. Father Mateo stood in the center of the church, arms raised, trembling. He remembered the mirror, the relic, the confessional, the bleeding cross, and knew the truth. The blood didn't seek punishment. It sought revelation. He whispered a prayer, and the blood froze for a heartbeat, the tiniest moment of silence in the storm. "Confess," he said, voice steady, echoing across the village. "To yourself first, then to God. Only truth can stop this." For the first time, some listened. Eyes filled with tears, mouths whispered apologies, hands pressed together in desperate devotion. The blood receded slowly, grudgingly, as if tasting honesty for the first time. But Father Mateo knew the reprieve was temporary. The cross above the altar glistened faintly with moisture, ready to bleed again, because as long as sin remained hidden, the village would never be dry. And somewhere deep in Saint Aurelia, the whisper began anew. "We see you hiding. We are patient. We will wait." The villagers looked at one another, fear and shame painting their faces, and for the first time they realized that salvation wasn't a promise. It was a choice, a confession away. Chapter 16. The priest who dreamed of sin, Father Mateo, hadn't slept in 3 nights. Not because of the village, not because of the blood that followed their every secret, but because of the dreams. They came first as whispers, gentle and barely audible, echoing in the hollow space behind his eyes. Then they grew louder, forming images, smells, voices. Every sin he had ever witnessed, every confession he had ever heard, twisted into living tableau that played in the theater of his mind. Last night, he dreamed of the saint who forgot her name. She knelt before him, her hands empty but reaching, eyes bleeding light, whispering truths he had never dared to know. Her lips moved, forming words that cracked the walls of the chapel around him. "Do you see now, Father?" she asked. "Do you see the sins you shielded, the lies you ignored?" He awoke in a cold sweat. The cross above the altar dripped, not blood this time, but a thick darkness that smelled of earth and iron. His hands shook as he reached to touch it. The droplets formed words almost instantly, scorching into the wood. Even dreams cannot hide the guilty. Night after night, the dreams became visions. The village appeared in them, streets twisting impossibly, buildings bleeding shadows. He saw the black mirror from the confessional chamber, cracked and alive, reflecting his face in dozens of forms, each one whispering a confession he had not yet heard aloud. And then he saw them, the villagers. He was inside every home at once, witnessing every secret. The mother hiding her stolen bread beneath the floorboards, the boy who whispered cruel words to a friend, the man who prayed for forgiveness but plotted revenge. Every sin illuminated in red light, every truth exposed as if the cross had reached into the very marrow of their bones. He awoke screaming, clutching the cross, drenched in sweat, only to find that the altar below him was covered in a sheen of blood that pulsed like a heartbeat. The blood spoke, not with words this time, not with whispers. It thought in a way that bypassed language, scraping at the edges of his mind, showing him the sins yet to come, the ones the village had not yet committed, the lies yet to be spoken. Father Mateo understood then that the cross had not chosen him by accident. It had always chosen a guardian, someone to see every hidden thing, someone to bear the weight of confession not yet offered. He fell to his knees. His prayers were not for himself, not for the village. They were for the sins trapped in the hearts of men, sins that would never rest until confessed, sins that the cross would hunt as relentlessly as it hunted him now. A shadow fell across the altar. The saint who forgot her name appeared, her form flickering like a candle in wind. "You cannot close your eyes," she whispered. "The guilty never sleep, and neither can you." "Not while the cross waits." He tried to scream, but no sound came. The church itself seemed to breathe, the pulsing blood echoing the rhythm of his own terrified heart. And then he saw it, a single droplet fall from the cross, hitting the altar with a soft thump. In that moment, he understood. The dreams were only the beginning, because sin, like the cross, never rests, and neither would he. Chapter 17. The Choir of Hidden Voices. The church had never been so quiet. Even the wind seemed to pause outside Saint Aurelia, as if the village itself held its breath. Father Mateo stood at the pulpit, clutching the cross. every muscle taut with anticipation. Tonight, the Mass would begin, but he already knew that this would not be a service of prayer or peace. He could hear them before anyone else arrived, faint whispers, rising from the stone floorboards curling through the pews, voices with no visible source, soft but distinct, like echoes trapped in a canyon too narrow to escape. The villagers entered slowly, eyes downcast, hands clasped, yet they could not stop glancing at the altar. Something was different tonight. The cross above it was glistening, veins of blood running like tiny rivers, pulsing in rhythm with a sound they could not hear but somehow felt. The whispers grew louder as the congregation knelt. Father Mateo cleared his throat, trying to steady his voice. "Let us pray," he began. But even he noticed the way the murmurs were not of his making. Then came the singing. It was not the choir he had rehearsed. The notes were imperfect, distorted, yet harmonious in a way that twisted the heart. Each villager's hidden sin, the anger unspoken, the desire forbidden, the betrayal swallowed, was being sung back at them in voices not their own, yet unmistakably theirs. The mother who had hoarded bread felt her shame resonate in a soprano, high and keening. The blacksmith who had taken coins meant for the poor heard his theft reverberate as a bass line, vibrating through the walls. Every confession ever hidden was now audible, now undeniable. Father Mateo tried to command silence, but the choir would not obey. The cross above bled faster. The droplets fell like percussion, hitting the stone floor in a rhythm too precise to be random. Shadows of light and red twisted around the altar, forming shapes that seemed to nod in time with the music. A scream broke from the back of the church, then another, until the whispers, the singing, and the cries merged into a single symphony. The saint who forgot her name appeared behind the altar, her figure luminous and terrible. She raised her arms, conducting the choir of sins. Her voice pierced the chaos, crystal clear. "Sing, confess, let the guilty hear themselves." Father Mateo fell to his knees, hands pressed to his ears, but the sound had already invaded his mind. He heard himself confessing every hesitation, every hidden doubt, every fear he had buried beneath prayer and ritual. And then, impossibly, the voices began to chant his sins back at him, louder, faster, relentless. The congregation wept, shivered, and some prayed aloud for the first time in years. Others tried to flee, but the doors had vanished, replaced by walls that reflected their faces, contorting them into masks of their worst selves. The cross pulsed, the blood dripping like heartbeat and metronome together. The choir sang, not in words, but in truth. And in that instant, every soul in Saint Aurelia understood. Confession was not optional. It had become survival. Father Mateo opened his mouth to speak, but no sound emerged. Only the choir answered, carrying their sins upward toward the bleeding cross. And as the final note faded into the shadows, a single voice lingered, deep, hollow, eternal. Sin may hide, but it never sleeps. Chapter 19. The night the cross walked. The villagers had long feared the altar, the confessional, the mirror, but no one had expected the cross itself to move. It began with a whisper, a faint sound, like wood scraping over stone. Father Mateo, kneeling before the pulpit, froze. The cross above the altar trembled, then slid silently along the surface of the wall. By midnight, it was gone from the church. The altar stood empty, the pulpit bare. Outside, the villagers swore they saw a shadow against the fog. The cross, moving upright as though guided by invisible hands, its blood dripping steadily, leaving a trail of red that glowed faintly in the darkness. Father Mateo followed, heart pounding. Every step he took, the air thickened with the weight of unspoken sins. The cross stopped at the first house, a cottage belonging to the blacksmith who had cheated the town's poor. Blood dripped from its edges, forming letters in the dirt outside the door. Truth cannot be hidden. Inside, the blacksmith awoke with a start. He had dreamt of the cross before, yes, but this was no dream. It was moving through his room, hovering above him, pulsing. Every hidden act of greed, every lie he had whispered, appeared before his eyes as vivid phantoms, coins turning to worms, shadows mocking his face, neighbors' eyes accusing him silently. He fell to his knees, shaking, and the cross tilted toward him. a silent command. Father Mateo reached the doorway just in time to witness the next house. The cross had grown heavier, larger, almost alive, dragging itself across the village streets. Blood slicked the cobblestones, carrying with it the faint scent of iron and fear. Every villager who dared peek from their windows or doors saw the same terror. The cross paused before them, tilted as though listening, pulsing with judgment. And with every pulse, fragments of memory surfaced, misdeeds, desires, betrayals, all illuminated in red, impossible to deny. Children screamed at shadows of their own imagination. Mothers wept, confessing sins aloud in the street, hoping the cross would accept their pleas. Fathers clutched their hearts, realizing the cross was not just a symbol. It was a judge, a sentinel, a hunter of what they had dared to hide. Father Mateo followed the trail to the churchyard, where the cross paused, upright against the fog, dripping blood into the earth. The saint who forgot her name appeared beside him, her luminous form reflecting in the pools of red. "See now, priest," she whispered. "The cross walks for those who cannot confess. It carries the weight of their guilt, and it will not stop until the truth is spoken." The cross pulsed, a heartbeat of judgment, and the villagers realized the final truth. Their sins were no longer theirs alone. They belonged to the blood, to the shadows, to the walking cross that demanded acknowledgement. That night, the cross returned to the church, upright once more, yet still pulsing, still alive with the weight of every hidden misdeed. Father Mateo fell to his knees before it, trembling, whispering, "Forgive us. Forgive us all." And the cross, as though listening, pulsed brighter than ever, a warning and a promise. Hidden sins will never rest, and neither will I. Chapter 20. The day the cross remembered. The morning of reckoning came without warning. Saint Aurelia awoke under a sky smeared with iron-red clouds, the sun weak behind its veil. The villagers gathered in the church, silent, trembling, aware that this day was not for prayer, but for judgment. The cross hung above the altar, more vivid than ever. Its wood pulsed as if breathing, veins of blood snaking across its surface, not dripping now but glowing from within. It had remembered every sin ever concealed, every word ever whispered in darkness, every desire denied, every betrayal hidden beneath smiles and handshakes. Father Mateo stood before it, hands clasped in futile prayer. The saint who forgot her name floated beside him, her presence serene yet terrible. "It has remembered, Father," she said, "and now it decides." The villagers felt it first in their bones, a vibration that was not sound, not wind, but judgment itself. The cross knew who would be forgiven and who would pay. Each beat pulsed with names, sins, and faces, searing recognition into the minds of all who were present. A hush fell. Then the blood pulsed outward like waves, brushing against the first villager, a young woman who had lied to protect a lover's secret. She fell to her knees, tears streaming, and whispered a confession aloud. The cross pulsed once. Her blood-stained reflection in the altar shimmered, then vanished. Forgiven. Next, the blacksmith who had stolen from the poor tried to kneel, pleading. The cross shuddered, but the blood did not recede. Instead, it rose, forming words in the air above him. "Some sins are remembered, not forgiven." His screams echoed through the church as shadows reached from the cross, coiling around him, forcing every secret he had ever hidden into his throat until he gasped confession after confession in a voice that was no longer entirely his own. Father Mateo watched, horrified yet mesmerized. The cross did not discriminate by age, status, or innocence. It moved with purpose, pulsing with moral memory, choosing which hearts could breathe freely, which would bear their guilt forever. The saint's voice cut through the horror. The cross remembers what God cannot forgive because men hide it too long. It judges because you failed to confess. One by one, villagers faced the cross. Some were freed, tears turning to light as their sins left them behind. Others were trapped in spectral chains of their own misdeeds, memories of blood and betrayal looping endlessly in their minds. The church walls reflected every act, every lie, every betrayal, amplifying the judgment like mirrors in hell. Father Mateo approached the cross at last, trembling. His own sins, failures, doubts, moments of cowardice rose before him in vivid, tangible form. He whispered, "I'm guilty. I'm weak. I hid what I should have revealed." The cross pulsed once, and then miraculously it receded its judgment. Not entirely, not forgiving entirely, but enough for him to survive. The villagers left the church that day, some free, some haunted, all forever changed. Saint Aurelia would never be the same. The cross remained still pulsing, still alive, a sentinel that remembered everything, waiting for the next sin, the next secret. Father Mateo knelt before it, exhausted, and understood the eternal truth. Sin may hide, but it cannot escape. And the cross will always remember. Outside, the sky cleared slightly, but the air still carried the scent of iron and warning. The cross watched. It waited. And in Saint Aurelia, every soul knew that no sin, no matter how deeply buried, could ever truly vanish again.
Epilogue. Silence that speaks years had passed in Saint Aurelia. Yet the memory of that terrible month lingered like a shadow that never left. The village had changed. Doors remained unlocked, windows unbarred. Yet the people moved with a cautious reverence, as though every step might awaken the cross again. Father Mateo was older now, hair streaked with silver, hands lined with fatigue and prayer. He still visited the church daily, kneeling before the cross, though it hung quietly above the altar. Its wood was still rich and dark, its veins faintly glowing, a heartbeat waiting in silence. The villagers whispered that the cross had grown patient. It no longer chased them from house to house, nor did the bells ring themselves in judgment. Yet every hidden sin, every unspoken word, every lie withheld from confession remained etched in its memory. Sometimes, in the still hours of night, those who dared walk past the church swore they could hear a faint drip, like distant blood falling in rhythm. Shadows would shift on the walls, and for a fleeting moment, they could see faces in the glow of the altar, not threatening, not cruel, but waiting. Father Mateo understood, as he had all along. The cross did not punish out of malice, it bore witness, it remembered, and in that remembrance, it offered both warning and salvation. A sin may be hidden, but it is never gone. He placed his hand on the wood one final time, feeling the faint pulse beneath his palm. "Rest, old friend," he whispered. "May your judgment be patient, but unwavering." The cross pulsed once, softly, as though acknowledging him, then it hung silently, watching, remembering, eternal. Outside, the village moved cautiously forward, each soul carrying the lesson learned. Truth must be faced, sins must be spoken, secrets left in darkness only grow heavier with time. And in Saint Aurelia, the cross waited, as it always had, ready to bleed again whenever a sin was hidden, because some things are too sacred to be forgotten, and some truths too heavy to be concealed.